Euphrasie Barbier. Chapter 5. 1861. The New Beginning. How strange to be only two of us again, thought Euphrasie. It was like the early days in London, but different too in so many ways. This time they were not scouts leading the way for a big supportive family. This time they were alone, and they alone carried all the responsibility of setting up a new group and preparing it to face the trials of missionary life at the ends of the earth. London had been strange and frightening, but the future facing them now was even more hazardous and unpredictable. At once they organized a routine of prayer, study, and work. Their minds and hands were never idle. They earnestly asked God's help for themselves, for their new undertaking, for the poor savages waiting so far away. They learned all they could about the geography and history of the South Pacific and the Cannibal Isles. They cut and sewed endlessly, sometimes at paying jobs to earn a little cash, and sometimes to make another useful article to pack in their large travelling trunk. As well, Mother Mari and Sister Wilfred often went out to speak to church groups about their missionary project. Within weeks, several young women were eagerly preparing themselves to set off to New Zealand with the new missionary congregation. A message had been sent to Bishop Viard that the sisters he had requested were now ready. Every day Euphrasie and Sister Wilfred hoped for the summons to come. They used the time of waiting to prepare themselves the better. At last, one day in October, the longed-for letter came, and Euphrasie's hopes were again dashed. The bishop had found his sisters elsewhere. He would keep them in mind, though, he said, in case of further need. Father Favre felt let down too, but he encouraged Euphrasie. "God's will be done, Reverend Mother," he said. "No doubt he has better plans for us. In the meantime, let us set up your congregation soundly here in Lyon." In the back of his mind, an old dream began to shape up more clearly. Years ago, a number of pious laywomen had gone to help the missionaries in the Pacific Islands. Many of them were now old, scattered in lonely places where they had settled years ago. They were now no one's responsibility. "What if we formed them into some kind of religious order?" thought Father Favre. "Some of them are rather tough and eccentric old women, after all these years of living alone. But what support and comfort, and even physical care they could get now in old age and sickness, if they had such a spiritual bond." He began to talk over his ideas with Mother Mari. "Our old missionaries, our dear anciens, pioneers as we call them, such wonderful work they have done for God all these years. Now, if we plan some kind of loose affiliation, but first, of course, we must get your congregation soundly established." Euphrasie agreed that sound spiritual formation was their first need. Practical details, too, were clamouring for attention. What would they call the new congregation? What habit would the sisters wear? What would they have for the rule and constitutions? And where would they live? The tiny apartment lent by the Marist fathers had been sufficient for two of them, but soon they must make room for the girls coming to join them. In November, Euphrasie rented a house at 7 Rue Clayburg. It was on the same hill as the Marist father's house, close to the old shrine of Our Lady of Fouvier, which topped the hill. It had a garden facing the sunny south and seemed just right for a convent. Euphrasie and Sister Wilfrid decided that Christmas Day would be the official start of their new novitiate. They would celebrate it by having their clothing ceremony. They designed and sewed their new habits: a long black tunic, a stiff arched white coif or hood framing the face, a plain stiff white collar, a long soft black veil, and a black and silver crucifix on a blue cord hanging around the neck. The sisters' devotion to Our Lady was symbolized by a large wooden rosary hanging from the belt. For going out and for solemn occasions, they made large detachable dress sleeves and a plain full-length black mantle bound with blue. The finished outfit seemed to them full of symbolism, and yet simple, practical, and attractive, with its neat lines and distinctive colouring. They folded each outfit into a neat bundle and put it aside in the chapel to wait for the clothing ceremony. They were determined to make the occasion as sacred as possible. "Let us make a retreat in preparation for Christmas," Euphrasie suggested. "In spirit, let us stay with Mary as she prepares for the birth of Jesus, and let us prepare our hearts for him." All was ready by Christmas Eve. At midnight, Father Yarden, one of their new Marist friends, said the first Mass in the chapel and installed the Blessed Sacrament. At 7 o'clock on Christmas morning, Father Favre came to say Mass and give the Holy Habit to the two sisters. It was a very simple ceremony without singing or sermon. At the end of Mass, he handed each sister her bundle of folded clothing, blessed them both with a sprinkle of holy water, and knelt at the altar to recite the traditional hymn, "Come, Holy Spirit." After blessing the whole house with holy water, he went away. For the little ceremony, there were only 2 visitors present, both young women seriously considering religious life for themselves. Once they were alone, Mother Mary and Sister Wilfrid retired to put on their new habits. Together they knelt in the chapel. In the silence, they were wrapped up in the same thought. Now we have started. From now on, we can call ourselves Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions. It was a name they had chosen to symbolize their whole vocation. By February, several girls had started on the postulant's course of prayer, study, and work. A number of young women had asked to join, but Mother Mary had to pick and choose. Some were not mature enough yet. Others, she realized, were looking for adventure rather than devotion. There were even 2 aspirants who seemed remarkably ignorant of their faith. When they disappeared suddenly one day, Euphrasie was not surprised to learn that they were police spies sent to check out that the new community in Rue Clayburg was exactly what it seemed. In those politically unstable times, the authorities were apt to see a secret revolutionary group in any new organization which led a quiet, retiring life. In June, 7 of the postulants were given the holy habit and new religious names, and another 7 were preparing for their turn Mother Mary of the Heart of Jesus planned a good practical and spiritual training for her novices. Often she taught them herself, but she also employed skilled outsiders to enrich the novices' education. There was teacher training available from the Sisters of St. Charles nearby, and nurse training at the Hospice for Incurables. The Marist Fathers regularly lectured in religious studies, and there were classes in history, geography, science, music, singing, and the arts. First of all, Reverend Mother had to check that the aspirants knew the basic truths of their faith. Of course, all had made their First Communion and been confirmed before entering the novitiate, but some good girls had had little or no formal education, and their religious instruction had been minimal. Even for the well-educated, Euphrasie insisted that there was always more to learn. Real appreciation of the teachings of the Church was essential to spiritual growth, and there also had to be instruction in the principles and day-to-day living of consecrated religious life. Euphrasie was quick to co-opt the skills and knowledge of the new recruits themselves. A humble little peasant shoemaker was surprised to find herself instructing her social betters, and even Reverend Mother herself, in the new art of making and mending footwear. Reverend Mother was adamant that tradesmen's skills and laborious work in house and garden were just as valuable and honourable in God's service as book learning and fine arts. A missionary must be able to turn her hand to anything, she used to say. When we economize and make do with what we have, we are practicing poverty seriously. When we come to religious life, we sell what we have and give to the poor, as the Gospel says. When we make a vow of poverty, what we have, house, furniture, food, clothing, money, no longer belongs to us personally. Legally, of course, it belongs to the congregation, but in reality it belongs to God and His Church. It is held in trust for those who need it most. That is why, from the day you entered, you have been taught to ask permission for the simplest things you need. Even those in charge of finances cannot buy or sell or borrow or lend money or property independently. All the new entrants understood that sisters never marry. The very word nun was a byword for primness and austerity. "Do you think I'm a nun?" had been the cheeky retort of many a wayward girl. Mother Mary explained the vow of chastity as a special kind of consecration. A vow can be made only to give up something good for something better. So, in the vow of chastity, we give ourselves body and soul in a special way to God as our spouse. It was not that Euphrasie despised marriage. She had seen the great spiritual benefits and happiness of too many good marriages, her own parents a living example. She herself was filled with joy and awe in her own special vocation, and it was the greatest gift she could wish upon any of the young aspirants. But such a delicate gift was difficult for human nature, she knew. Perhaps most difficult of all for personalities naturally loving and spontaneous. That is why our thoughts and feelings must be guarded, protected, by external modesty and prudence, she would say. That is why we must constantly trust in God's help. As St. Paul says, "For men it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. That is why we must use the sacraments God has given to nourish and strengthen us. Mother Mary had no illusions either about the vow of obedience, and she tried to prepare her novices thoroughly. A command made formally under your vow of obedience, "Do this at once or you are out," is a very rare thing, she explained. But the vow of obedience is perhaps the widest and the greatest of all the vows because it includes everything. By our deep spirit of obedience to God's will, we give Him our independence, our every choice. But in all three vows, we aim always at living not just the exact letter of the laws we have promised to keep. We try to grow always in the real spirit of each vow, to cultivate what we call the virtues of poverty, chastity, and obedience. That is why we attach so much importance to our little everyday customs, to the permissions we ask for little things from the storeroom, to the little customs of modesty and self-denial we practice in our comings and goings, to the silence in the house which recalls us to God's presence within us. These are the ways we try to devote our whole lives to our Saviour, who loves us so much, without stealing back indulgence for our own willfulness or selfishness. Reverend Mother often raised some laughs too, when she shrewdly spoke of the deviousness of self-love, the sometimes unconscious selfishness which uses little tricks and excuses to get what it wants. "I can't do this today because I had a headache yesterday, and I might have a headache tomorrow." Serious or amusing, her instructions did not fall on deaf ears, but sometimes, inspired though they were by her words and loving example, the novice's goodwill was not always equal to the challenges of community life. "If it were not for God, I wouldn't stay 1 moment longer in this house," shouted one enraged young lady as she stormed out from a disagreement. "And neither would I," retorted Mother Mary, just as emphatically. The astonished novice turned back to see the little Reverend Mother waiting calmly. Tears and quieter words gradually soothed the aching heart and furious feelings, and finally opened up a possible solution to what had seemed an unbearable problem. For all her apparent calmness, Euphrasie was surprisingly understanding of characters more turbulent and undisciplined than herself. Stern or smiling or teasing kindly, she could be quite relentless in pointing out faulty behaviour or thinking. She could also be amazingly patient in waiting for willfulness or stubbornness to give way to basic goodness, and the final difficult decision to yield to God, even at painful cost to pride. A very ambitious young sister, who insisted that she was to be a teacher and nothing else, was putting pressure on her novice mistress. "If she refuses to bend her will, she has no true vocation," Euphrasie said. "Do not let her study, but if she shows willingness to be guided by holy obedience in spite of her personal preferences, she will do God's work well. Then, if she has the ability, by all means train her for teaching." Other novices met up with similar discipline. "This sister has no vocation to the foreign missions as long as she insists that she must go," wrote Mother Mary. "However, if she comes to accept that her mission is to serve wherever God sends her, then she will be a very useful sister to send. This policy was consistent. Though Euphrasie was quick to see and encourage each sister's natural gifts, first and foremost, she taught them to find true self-giving in submitting their personal preferences to the more objective decisions of those whose work it was to interpret the needs of the church and of the congregation. Again and again she insisted, in God's work, nothing is trivial or unworthy. To labour endlessly in some humble duty at home is to be just as much missionary as to teach in the foreign missions. The Marist fathers continued to be generous friends to Euphrasie and Sister Wilfrid, but right from the beginning it had been agreed that the new congregation was to be self-supporting financially and quite independent of the Marists. The fathers were willing to advance a loan from time to time for some important development, but for day-to-day living the sisters had to find their own keep. Some of the postulants entered with a modest contribution for their support. From time to time there was a donation of money or goods, which the sisters greeted as a gift from heaven. Every day, every person worked to supply their needs, but there was no regular income. Domestic and craft work brought in small earnings. The garden plots and the orchard provided some food. Clothes and shoes were made by hand, often from other people's rejected scraps of fabric. No time or material or foodstuff was ever wasted, but the sisters' poverty remained stark. When the winter of 1862 came in bitterly cold, there was no money to spare to heat the house. Even the kitchen stove was largely fed by gleanings from the hillside and garden. Without a word of complaint, the novices gathered precious pieces of brick from the yard and laid them in every empty space on the kitchen stove while the meal was being cooked. As they ate, they warmed their numb fingers around their hot soup bowls. Later, as they worked, they were able to warm their frozen feet on the hot bricks. The Marist fathers were faithful friends in another way too. They often sent pious young women to meet the sisters at Rue Clayburgh, and some of these sisters eventually joined their friends in the novitiate. It seemed that God was blessing the new congregation in every way. In the evenings, before the last prayers of the day, the sisters sat together at recreation, chatting and laughing easily, while their fingers were busy with their knitting or needlework. After the long and strenuous working day, this time of relaxation was very precious, and their tongues made up for lost time. There was so much to talk about, so many hopes and dreams to share and develop. There were times, too, when homesickness and weariness and discouragement could eat away at young hearts. It helped then to find that one's new friends understood and shared the hurts as well as the fun and challenge of this new life. Sometimes the young sisters talked about the various and even surprising ways God had led them to the novitiate. One evening, young Sister Mary Joseph was coaxed to tell her story. For some time I had been praying about my vocation, she said shyly, and one night I had the strangest dream. A voice was saying to me, "Listen, Rue Clayburgh, Rue Clayburgh." and I saw a strange sister of an order I'd never seen before. When I woke up, I remembered the dream clearly, but it seemed a lot of silly, muddled ideas, like any dream, and I gradually forgot all about it. One day, a long time afterwards, last year it was, I went to confession as usual to one of the Marist fathers, and told him I felt I was wasting my life. I felt God was calling me to do something for him. He said, "Go and see my good friends the sisters in Rue Clayburgh. Have a talk with them." That name, Rue Clayburgh, reminded me about that strange dream. Well, one day I plucked up my courage and came to the street here. I rang the doorbell, and when Sister Wilfred answered the door, I nearly dropped with shock. "She was the sister in your dream," interrupted one of the novices, clapping her hands. "Oh no, not her, but her habit was exactly the same. I had never seen it before, but I can still remember what that sister looked like, and she was dressed exactly like us." She paused for a moment. That's when I knew that God wanted me to come here. The other sisters sometimes told of strange coincidences in their lives too. Maybe not as remarkable as Sister Mary Joseph's, but enough to convince each one of them that God had called her here. The newcomers were not all inexperienced young girls, though. One day Mother Mary was surprised and delighted to be joined by an old friend from the Sisters of Compassion in London. She was Sister Mary of the Angels, who had been wrestling with her original missionary vocation ever since Euphrasie had left London. By the beginning of 1863, the novitiate was well established. There were more than a dozen novices. The older novices were maturing well, and there was a good group of postulants trying earnestly to prepare themselves for their clothing. One evening, as they sat at their recreation, talking of the day's successes and failures, Euphrasie had a suggestion to make. If we all worked just 1 hour longer each day, and every day put aside a little of our earnings, we could support a few needy children and give them a good Christian education. If we reorganized the house a little, we could make room for 6 children. We could open a small orphanage. What do you think of that idea? The novices were all enthusiastic. Within a few weeks the convent became home to 6 little girls who had no one in the world to care for them. A few days later, another ragged and emaciated little girl was brought along. The sisters had no more room, but this child had been abandoned. She had nothing. No one wanted her. Room was made for just one more, and she was squeezed into the orphanage. A few weeks later, another destitute child came, and then another, and another. Any girl preparing to be received as a novice spent up to a year in training as a postulant. With the clothing ceremony, she began her official novitiate training. 12 months later, she might be allowed to make her first vows, if she seemed to be ready. After 18 months to 2 years of temporary vows, she could make her final vows. Mother Mary was leader of her congregation and its novice mistress. She had come with her vows already made, but according to the existing regulations binding religious orders, her congregation had not existed long enough for any of its members to have made final vows. Technically, she was still a novice herself. Because of her past experience and her position, she was not really obliged to follow the usual stages of progress, but she wanted no exceptions or privileges for herself, even as foundress of the congregation. By June 1864, she had fulfilled the time set by rule, and she began to prepare for her final vows in her new congregation. For such an important celebration, she chose her own special feast day, the Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which fell on 3rd of June that year. She decided to prepare herself by an 8-day retreat. She informed the novices that for 8 days she would stay alone in her room, apart from the times of common prayer. This was to be a sacred time of prayer and self-denial. She was grateful to God for all that He had done in her life, but sometimes, and especially at times like this, she was overwhelmed by the thought of God's goodness and her own blindness and lack of appreciation. While Euphrasie was engrossed in her retreat, the novices began to make secret preparations. As fast as they could, they finished their daily work, and then they crept around the convent, planning in whispers, working and practicing in odd, out-of-the-way corners like the little dark basement, or the tiny attic in the peak of the roof, or the woodshed at the back of the garden. They did not want their mother to hear the faintest sound which would let her guess that they were planning something unusual. The day before the festival, they had everything ready. "The celebration really starts tomorrow," said the senior novice, "so we'll wait as long as possible tonight before we surprise her. When we've finished everything, absolutely everything for today, then we'll start." Late that evening, they all gathered silently outside Reverend Mother's door, without whispering, hardly daring to breathe, each carefully pressing one hand against the large rosary beads at her side to stifle their telltale rattle. Silently, they arranged themselves as they had rehearsed. Those in the front row carried a lovely bouquet of flowers from their own garden, and also a greeting card written and painted by themselves. Those at the back of the group held up a gift from them all, a beautiful piece of handwork, a delicately plaited arrangement of vine branches and corn sheaves to decorate the altar in their chapel. The novice nearest the door knocked firmly, and they waited breathlessly, smiling in anticipation. They heard footsteps, the rattle of the door handle. The door opened, and Mother Mari peered out, somewhat puzzled. "Happy feast day, Reverend Mother," they chorused, and then stopped dead. Mother Mari turned white and then flushed. She was not smiling. "Sisters, what? Who told you to? Who gave you permission? How? When did you do this?" Abruptly, she turned back into her room and shut the door noisily. The novices were shocked. Had they done something terribly wrong? Father Yarden, their spiritual director, had approved their plans. They had meant only to celebrate a wonderful occasion, the first final vows ceremony in the congregation. Hardly daring to look at each other, they drifted away in silence, nonplussed and shamed. The sister responsible for the altar arrangement picked it up and carried it to the chapel. She lifted it up onto the altar. The wheat and vines looked beautiful. "That's what it was made for," there it will stay, she said to herself. I may as well be hanged for a sheep as for a lamb. But what will she say when she hears the singing tomorrow? The novices had spent hours learning to sing a whole Latin Mass. At the beginning of Mass the next morning, they started nervously, but they had practiced well and the sound was beautiful. Euphrasie had regained her composure and was intent on worship and her act of consecration. She accepted the sisters' attempts to celebrate the occasion. That evening, when they presented a skit in verse about their secret activities of the last 8 days, she even laughed heartily with them at the recital of their many predicaments. Unpolished and even childish though the performance was, Euphrasie suddenly realized that the novice's determination to celebrate her day of final consecration showed how much they valued their own religious vocation. The novices were happy again, but secretly a little puzzled. Had Reverend Mother really been angry with them last evening? Now it seemed not. Had she been extremely embarrassed that they had gone to so much trouble to give her pleasure? It had been their own idea entirely to spend so many hours preparing the surprises when they were already overworked and overtired. She had never claimed the slightest privilege for herself. She was their leader, but in some ways she was the most self-effacing of them all. The crybaby of the group wiped her eyes furtively and hoped desperately that Mother had forgiven them for whatever it was. It was the toughest and most level-headed of the novices who had a suspicion about Reverend Mother, a suspicion she never dared to voice. She herself knew that terrible feeling when control snaps inside. The heart chokes and the eyes sting, and one is terrified and humiliated, terrified that the tears will burst out publicly, shamefully.